If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. People, what is your most terrifying supernatural encounter or unexplainable experience story? When I was a kid, I put on gel in front of the mirror. My bedroom door was locked. When I finished, I tried placing the lid back on the jar with my sticky gel hands. I dropped it and hit my foot, and it slid under the bed. I was like, duck, and dried my hands with a little towel. Then, as I was bending over to pick up the lid from under the bed, it slid back out. On its own. I didn't panic or anything, but I did look under the bed, and there was absolutely nothing where it could have bounced off of. Also, by the time I reached for it, it wouldn't make sense either way. But I always think about it. What was it? What pushed the lid back out? I'll never have an answer. Used to work in hospice care. A woman who was dying of a brain tumor had 2 Siamese cats she adored. She had pictures on her wall and, while lucid, would tell me about them often. The night she passed, I called hospice and waited in the living room. It was summer, and the front screen door was open. I look over and see 2 identical Siamese cats sitting there. Thinking I'd lost my mind, I took a picture of them. They were real. Her cats had passed 8 years before. I'm a rational and logical person, and I think there's a rational and logical explanation for most ghostly phenomena. I cannot explain those cats. My grandfather had been in World War II and told us about when he and a few other soldiers had been separated from his unit, and were trying to get to Normandy. They had gone through a clearing in a wooded area but had to drop when they heard something approaching. They were on their bellies in 3 feet of grass when they saw 20 or 30 German soldiers running across the clearing, clearly in a state of panic, and then they just froze in mid-step. He said they resembled statues, that some weren't even touching the ground, and that there was no noise whatsoever, even the birds had gone silent. After a few seconds, there was a loud noise like metal scraping on concrete, and the frozen soldiers started to become blurry to the point at which they vanished without a trace. This had been reported by all of the soldiers that were present, and all were called to the War Office in London after their return to the UK, where they were pressed on what they saw over the course of a few days. Were taken back to the same spot in France shortly after the war had ended. Surprisingly, when they got there were other men sharing the same accommodation who reported similar occurrences in the exact same area. They were all taken to the woods and had to describe where and how the events took place. My granddad had said that the entire area was heavily guarded and that part of the ground was heavily excavated. The strangest thing of all the others, he said, was that there were hundreds of dogs in the area, just milling around for no apparent reason. They returned to the UK with a gag order ordering them never to speak about any of this. He went back to the same spot in France before he died in 1985 and said that the area had been covered with unmarked warehouses and was guarded by an unusually professional security company. He reckoned they were military. I've tried to find out more about this but can't find any records of it, but I do remember one of the guys who he was with the day. He used to come and visit sometimes and referred to the place as the Splintered Woods. I'm doing seasonal work out in Olympic National Park this summer and live in employee housing on the same property as my job. Throughout the summer, I have heard things like a giggle coming from my empty room and a sliding door closing on its own. One night about a month ago, something wild happened. The building I live in is backed up against an impenetrable coastal rainforest, and some friends and I were sitting in one of the apartment units chatting when we all noticed screaming coming from the woods. Initially, we thought it was a cougar, but it kept going and was decidedly human sounding. Sometimes it seemed more like sobbing, and in other moments it was frantic yelling. It went on for about 5 intense minutes, then stopped. Now the truly chilling part, about 30 seconds after the yelling stopped, what sounded like a disembodied woman's voice coming through a radio started muttering right next to where we were sitting. We couldn't make out what she was saying, and it only lasted a few seconds. It was in the room with us, but we couldn't see anything. One of my friends opened the door to make sure there was nobody outside, and we were completely alone. It should also be noted that everyone who lives in the building is in the same room, so all of the other units are empty. All of us who live here have puzzled over any logical explanation for what could have happened and just can't seem to find one. Not me, but my best friend and her boyfriend both insist that they got stuck driving in some sort of time loop. Something like they kept driving the same stretch of road over and over, and they were pretty freaked out, but my friend refused to pull over in that area, so they kept driving, and eventually the road changed. From what I remember, it was a dark night. There was some creepy tree in an open field along this road, and then a bridge that they went over before it would loop back. This was probably 8 years ago in North Washington State. After that, my friend would refuse to go up to that area. I was a freshman in college, and I was going camping with some new people I had just met. We were going to a mountain where I'd been camping many times before. We got there at 1 p.m. and set up camp. It slowly gets dark, and I get more and more drunk, but not too drunk. At this point, we're all gathered around the fire, playing charades. It's around 10 p.m. Our campsite is among the trees, and there's a large hill about 20 feet behind us. I have to pee, so I get up and start walking up the hill so that I can pee on the other side of it. The moon is nearly full, and I can see perfectly fine. I get to the top of the hill and begin to walk down the other side, which is a grassy clearing that meets up with the tree line again. Right as I'm pulling my pants down, I look at the tree line and freeze because there was a figure standing there, about 20 feet away from me. At this point, I'm so drunk that things are spinning, but I realize that what I'm seeing is not normal, and I get a grip. I try and look at it, and this is what I remember. It was standing on two legs, and its entire body was white. It was definitely facing me and looking at me, but I couldn't see its face exactly. It had a larger head. It was so white that it was almost glowing in the moonlight. I honestly don't know how long I stood there and stared at it, but it was a while because I was so in shock. Then it turned around and returned to the forest, still walking on two legs. I ran back to the fire and told everyone what had happened, but I didn't want to sound crazy, so I tried to be calm and nonchalant. Everyone was so drunk that we all brushed it off and forgot about it 10 minutes later. I even forgot about it until about a month later, when those memories hit me, and it's been on my mind ever since. It has really made me question my beliefs about the unexplained. What could it have been? This happened in southern Arizona. This incident happened a couple weeks after my family and I moved into our new house. It was built in the early 1990s on land that used to be a big cornfield for many years. We were the first family to live in it. One night, as I was sleeping in my new bedroom, I awoke to a feeling of absolute sheer terror. I was facing my closet, and I saw something crouched down in the corner of my room. It was just sitting there, staring directly at me. I knew it was something very evil because the air in the room felt suffocating and every part of my body was on full alert. I was just a little kid, but to me, this thing looked like a cross between a goblin and a gargoyle. That's the only way I could describe it at that time. Most of its features were obscured, but what I remember most was what looked like a stunted snout protruding from its face and really big lips. Weird, I know, but that's what I distinctly remember seeing. All I wanted to do was run. So that's what I did. I threw back my covers, praying my legs wouldn't get tangled up in them. They didn't. I jumped out of bed and bolted down the hallway and into my parents' bedroom. I was screaming and crying, and my parents went into my room, turned the lights on, and, of course, nothing was there. They were convinced I just had a nightmare, but no, I was definitely wide awake. Hands down one of the creepiest experiences I ever had. I grew up around a lot of kids and people from the Sac, Fox, and Kickapoo tribes, and I've had many people convincingly tell me their stories. The most common one is the little people. If you Google it, a lot of tribes believe in little people that live in the forest. You usually spot them out of the corner of your eye, but you're not supposed to directly acknowledge their presence, as they're mischievous. I've had quite a few people tell me they've seen them. I also had a professor who was Muskogee, and he wasn't one to tell tall tales or make stuff up. He told us he saw an owl man that was spoken about in their tribe. He wasn't a new age type or someone who would just make these things up. I've never seen anything, so I don't know. It seems that you have to be open to it to me. My native friends were hesitant to talk about it and had to trust you because most people would think they're crazy or impressionable. My dad once had an unexplained experience when I was a baby, but this only involves my older brothers, who are 5 years older than me. At the time, he was about 6. Let's call him John. My mom and dad lived in a small flat. My dad would come home every day after work, which would be a short time after my brothers were home from school. When my dad got to the apartment, he would have this thing where he would knock on the door while waiting for my mom to answer. My brother would run to the door knowing it was my dad and put his hand through the letterbox, and my dad would tug on his hand pretending to pull him through, or my dad would put his hand into the letterbox and tug on my brother's hand without being able to see it. I don't know how long this game went on, but one day my dad got home from work and knocked on the door. He waited a few seconds and then put his hand into the letterbox when John's hand didn't come out of it. My dad started tugging on my brother's hand and shaking it around. About 5 seconds later, my mom opens the door, and my dad looks around the door and into the hall, like, "Where's John?" My mom says John's been ill and in bed all day, he hasn't been to school. That's when my dad realized that the hand he was pulling on was not my brother's. I don't think he played that game anymore. A few years ago, I was on my way to the cinema with my husband. It was evening, so we left pretty early to get good seats. Where we lived to get to the cinema from our house was a 5 to 10 minute drive, straight to an intersection with traffic lights, then a right-hand turn, and through 3 roundabouts, then we were there. We left with 40 minutes to spare, expecting to arrive with 30 minutes to buy food and tickets, then queue for seats. We drove through the lights and were on the straight, having a casual conversation. I commented on a car that was driving up our ass, then suddenly we both had a really weird sensation of waking up, and we were driving down a random side road and were going really slowly. We both looked at each other, said what the hell, turned around, and got to the cinema right as the movie was starting. We lost about 20 to 25 minutes, no explanation. And I got really crappy seats. So I live in Georgia with my parents. Several years ago, they moved to South Pittsburgh, Tennessee. I visited them there on a few occasions, and it seems like their house was haunted. A couple had even stopped by to tell them about strange occurrences they had experienced. I'll talk to my parents tomorrow and update with more specific things if you're interested, but here's the creepiest. After they had stayed there for a while, my mother's name started sort of bleeding through the wall at a specific spot. Kind of brown lettering, like nicotine. But the weird thing is, I think the couple had mentioned something like that happening as well. I saw the markings on the wall. Other things included voices, footsteps in the hall, especially when in the bathroom. They could sometimes be heard almost right in front of the door, and occasional banging sounds. Okay, so a few years ago, back in 2014, I came across something that I had never seen before, and still to this day, I have no idea what it was. I remember the day as if it were yesterday. It was summer, and the evening was hot and sticky. My best friend Kay and I were on our way to Winchester, Ohio. She had been dating a boy, and they ended up breaking up like a few days before. We were going to his house to exchange property, and I was there to make sure everything went smoothly. After we exchanged property, we headed back to my town of Hillsboro. Winchester was like an hour or so away, so it was getting dark. We were on the back roads, listening to music, and just jamming out. We were, I am assuming, halfway home when we were coming over a hill. Night had fallen, and on the left side of the car was long grass. It was super long, like taller than me. As we reached the top of the hill, we saw a black figure come out of the long grass. At first, we thought it was some random animal since we were in the middle of nowhere. But as we got closer, we realized that it wasn't. The figure was on all fours and crawled on its hands and knees. I know that if it had stood up, it would have been at least 6 feet 4 inches, maybe taller. When our headlights hit it, we got a better look, and it turned its head and looked at us. It was completely black and shiny, looking like it was dipped in tar. Its eyes were round and milky white, and its mouth was full of sharp teeth. I remember my blood running cold, and Kay asked me what that was, but I didn't know. She asked me what we should do. I had a strange feeling that if we stopped the car, something bad was going to happen. So I told her to floor it and don't stop. As we got closer, it turned around and went back into the long grass. We haven't spoken about it since. Ever since I saw it, I've been trying to rack my brain to figure out what it was. I have done research and have come up with nothing, and just thinking about it sends chills down my spine. The following happened around 2014 in the Appalachian Mountains of Pennsylvania. I was about 14 or 15 years old when I had this initial experience, and it left my mind until I began researching abductions and different paranormal entities. Everyone within my rural area lives in forests and hunts religiously, and I am no exception to that rule. It was about October in archery buck season in Bedford, Pennsylvania. It was a normal evening of hunting at the base of the mountain in the swamps that my family owned. My dad wasn't near me at the time, as he was on the opposite end waiting for a large buck that he had been trying to ambush. I was sitting in my climber stand in a pine tree-packed area with 2 trails running underneath me. It was still fairly bright outside, with just a slight darkness in the area, enough that you could see the haze of a flashlight yet still see clearly ahead without it. I was facing the mountainside, so thick pine trees mostly covered the sky from my view. I heard leaves begin to crackle, and suddenly, roughly 5 or 6 deer ran full speed past my stand and back up the mountain. They came out of the pine saplings that lay in front of me as if they came from nowhere. At that moment, a massive LED-looking light flashed and seemed to fill the sky above me. It was a bluish light and covered 3 to 4 treetops. As quickly as it flashed, it left, however, and when it left, everything turned dark. It was ridiculous to think that it turned dark that quickly, as I couldn't see the reflective sight of my bow at that point. It was as if the sun just went out as soon as it went over the distant mountains on my back. I sat there dumbfounded, pondering what had happened for about 10 minutes before my dad came by side on the road. I left the stand that night weirded out by it, but I didn't think anything weird until the next day. I woke up with a cold sore on my left eye, which isn't unusual to me, as it happens all the time due to sunlight or stress. I got dressed and went to school, but as the day went on, I began to get a bad headache. I made it to lunch when a lunch lady, who was a personal friend, looked at me bewildered. I hadn't noticed, but the right side of my head was swollen severely. It was sticking out a good half-inch, almost giving me a lopsided appearance. She told me to go to the nurse's office quickly. I went to the nurse's suite, and she promptly called my mom to take me to the doctor as she thought I may have contracted shingles from a teacher who had an outbreak that month. We went to the doctor, and he looked at me and sent me home after explaining it was probably a poison of some kind while in the tree. I know my area, and there isn't poison oak locally. I don't get affected by poison ivy, though. After I got home, I forgot about the situation and moved on. My head got better, and I didn't give it much thought until this summer, when I had my first sleep paralysis situation. After I had it, I began to look into different paranormal stuff again, and for the first time, I looked into abduction stories and Mothman sightings. The conjunctivitis and different after effects made me think back to my experience in the tree stand. The reasons I am bringing this story up are because of the lost time that went by, the sudden flash and the deer appearing from nowhere without any prior sound, and the after effects of the experience that happened the day after. I don't remember seeing anything or having nightmares directly after the incident, but it makes me wonder what I saw that night. Unexplained creature. The first time was around the end of June, 2015, witnessed by myself and my girlfriend 30 miles east of Shoshone, Idaho, at my new home I just moved into in May. The old farmhouse had been vacant for a few years, surrounded by fields. The closest house was 5 miles away, and the closest town was 30 miles either way. Coming home at about 10 p.m. one night, I pulled off the main road onto the little dirt road leading to my house. At about 20 yards away from my headlights, I saw a skinny, dark creature on 2 feet and under 6 feet tall take a few steps towards the corral, put its right hand limb on the top of the corral fence, and go over the top. Not jumping, not running, with absolute ease doing it. My girlfriend and I freaked out, but what happened next was the chilling part. The corral or fence is neck or head high for me, and I'm 6 feet tall. After it went over the top, it dove below the fence and looked up not once but twice. Its eyes were glowing about a foot apart. I parked the truck at an angle with lights facing it. I ran 30 yards to get my gun and spotlight. My girlfriend was still in the truck, watching in fear for it to pop its head up again. I ran back, thinking, don't shoot it. What if it is someone just playing games? I shot above the corrals. After I fired, I could hear but not see something big moving further back through all the other corrals. The next morning, I found the spot where it stood, looking over the corral. 2 perfect indents were in the weeds and a trail where it escaped to the field. The second sighting was last night, June 7th, as it walked past my living room window, seen by myself and my teenage daughter. It walked past the window at the same time, just past 10. I ran out within seconds with my shotgun and spotlight. Nothing. It either has wings or is invisible. A couple with a ranch let me volunteer for a summer. I just wanted to learn how to care for horses and play cowboy. Well, they called me out and asked if I would do the evening feed for their animals while they went to visit their family in a town that was about an hour away. I said yes and got started. So I was alone with a bunch of horses and dogs. All of the horses were pinned up. I had not even let them into the pasture yet. The sun was still up. It was the opposite of a creepy time. Well, it took a left turn into a crazy town when I walked into the barn and I heard people start talking. I was all alone. Nobody was at least a mile in any direction, and there was almost no way anyone could sneak in to mess with me. The voices were very low and unclear. So I have no idea what was said. The only reason I know I'm not crazy is that the dogs that followed me and acted like they heard it too. One started barking at where the voices came from, and the other started running around the room, growling. I have experienced a lot of unexplainable things, but the most by far happened a few years ago. I was sitting on my couch knitting, and behind me was a desk and desk chair. I felt and heard someone running behind me. I turned quickly, thinking it was my kid, but nothing was there, and the desk chair was slightly spinning. I kind of had a moment and looked throughout the house, and everything was fine. I pushed it out of my mind, and I continued to knit. Then, from the corner of my eyes, I see this figure staring at me, peering from the side of my couch. I look, and I see it disappear. It was a little blonde boy with bright, almost glowing blue eyes, a greenish, blue-gray face, and a dark purple smile. I was on a camping trip with my school. At night, we put on a campfire, and we were all having fun. Suddenly, we heard someone screaming for help. That person sounded like a classmate of ours. I think his name was Kaido. I am half Japanese, and at that time I was in Japan. We came to the spot, we heard him scream, and then we again heard him saying, "I am here. Help me." We rushed there, only to see a shed. Then, we saw him running to us, asking, "What are you all doing here?" I was so scared, and I heard you all screaming, so I came here to see if you were all okay or not. Our teacher fainted, and I was so ducking scared that my soul left my body for a second. I went to a children's cemetery a few years ago with a bunch of buddies. It was a clear fall night when we got there, and as we stood watching, we saw what looked like clouds walking between the headstones. There were no real defined shapes, but they looked like they were walking and roughly person-shaped. We, all 7 of us, heard a little girl giggling and what sounded like a rope creaking from weight being dropped on it. All of the clouds were around the big oak tree in the middle of it, and it looked like one was hanging off a branch. We knocked out of there. On our way out, I saw 4 red glowing eyes in the back seat of my truck. Nothing in the truck was red or orange, and as I was driving, I could feel someone running with their hands on my face. Fingers under my jaw, back to my ears. My night got a lot weirder after that. I didn't sleep for 2 days following, and I still get nightmares from it. My mom and aunt have an interesting story with an old haunt. They grew up in the hollers in eastern Kentucky. One night, when they were 7 or 8 years old, they were sleeping in their grandma's house when my aunt awoke to someone whispering her name from the end of the bed. She said it sounded so terrifying that she was afraid to look, but it kept doing it. She shook my mom enough to wake her up, and my mom, too, heard it calling my aunt's name. They had the blankets over their heads, and my mom finally got the courage to look down to the end of the bed. She said there were 2 male figures, bloody, slightly decaying, and looking like they had been in a car accident. The figures stood at the end of their bed all night, whispering their names while my mom and aunt hid under the blankets. The figures eventually vanished before dawn. My mom and aunt swear truth to this story still today. When they told my grandpa about it that next morning, he said that he knew several people who had similar experiences and that those figures were called Bloody Bones and Rawhead in that area. These figures existed in southern folklore. When we were first married, my ex and I used to entertain ourselves by exploring the forests around where we lived. We'd use old logging roads and find cool, out-of-the-way places to explore and hang out. One late afternoon, we followed a typical road into a dead end, no houses for many miles, no camping areas. Shortly after we start walking, we come across an especially pretty meadow, congratulate ourselves for a great find, and keep exploring. After 20 minutes or so, I heard what I can only describe as a chorus of discordant singing. At the time, I had no idea what clairaudient was, but I knew right away that I wasn't hearing this with my natural ears. The singing was directional, coming from our left close by and up a little, not from the woods. We were still in a clearing. It seemed primarily female, and I couldn't make out any words. It was like a choir was singing just one note off key. It was tuneless and felt oppressive and very threatening. I looked at my husband, and he was hearing it too. We did not speak. "No, did you hear that, or what is that?" "No." After standing there for maybe a minute listening, one of us said, "Run." And we sprinted back to the truck and drove way too fast for several miles before slowing down. We didn't discuss it much. At the time, we both assumed it was demonic. Whatever it was unnatural and felt very negative. And, while I've had a couple of other clairaudient events since, I'm happy to have never experienced anything like that one since then. I have experienced something this week that is truly phenomenal that I cannot explain. Something so earth-shattering and reality-breaking that I am still in shock. Last Monday, August 17th, I went camping alone in Uwharrie National Forest. My goal was to de-stress and simply enjoy nature. I brought along a knife, some MREs, which are packs of freeze-dried food, essentially a tarp, and rope to construct a shelter. I arrive at the campground around 2 and begin my hike. It is deathly quiet. The only wildlife I encounter is 2 deer at the beginning of the trail. They squeal and run away. As I'm hiking, I notice a large amount of quartz deposits strewn about, enough to raise an eyebrow. I reach a valley clearing about a mile in and in between 2 streams. I constructed my shelter in the center. Old campfires littered about told me this place must be a good place to camp. After finishing my tarp tent, I began to walk around, exploring the area. I hear thunder and decide to head back to my shelter. Here is where things start to get strange. I'm getting goosebumps thinking about it still. I lay on my stomach in my tent. As the storm rolls in, I feel a strange pressure change, low bass frequency, and temperature drop, not that odd considering I'm in a valley. As it approaches, however, I feel a sensation I have never felt before. I can feel the storm above me in a way I can't fully describe. The best I can do to detail this feeling is that my consciousness was aware and expanded enough to feel this mass above me. I'm thinking, This is very weird, but don't entertain any thoughts of this possibly being paranormal. That is, until I hear the first sound. I hear a loud whoop. I'd guess a quarter mile away, the hairs stand up all over, and then it begins to pour rain very hard. At this point, I have no earthly idea what could have made that sound other than a very large animal that I'm unfamiliar with. Time passes, and I'm still lying in my tent. It's not quite dark, but it's raining, so I have nothing to do but scan the trees and listen. That's when I see the light. A very small, what looked like a coin reflecting in the sun, only there was no sun, and it was moving. It blinks on and off quickly, then reappears a few feet to the side, on and off again. I never saw it again. Not soon after I began to hear what in my mind were bipedal footsteps. They didn't seem like they came from a large animal, but I never saw what made them. They begin in the exact same spot I witnessed the light a few moments prior. I am staring intently at this spot, frozen in fear and clutching my knife, unable to move. It's silent until dusk, it's still raining, and then I hear the second whoop, much closer and louder, on the other side of my shelter. Whatever made this noise was maybe 50 feet away. Night falls, and adrenaline is pumping through me. I lay on my back. It was so dark that it did not matter if my eyes were open or closed. There was no noise for a few hours, and I began to relax slightly, that is, until I heard the babbling. I had set up in between two streams, so my rational brain was making me think it was just the water. It was not. If I had allowed myself to believe that I was actually hearing some sort of inhuman speech that far into the woods all alone, I would have panicked or perhaps blacked out with fear. I hear this intermittently throughout the night in two places. It's as if they are whispering to each other about me, not wanting to wake me up. I lose consciousness at some point, but awake to something being thrown at my tent, a small rock. Nothing more of note happens that I'm aware of until morning, when I get the hell out of there. I arrive home and immediately begin researching what could have possibly been making those noises. I look at deer, mountain lions, bears, even raccoons, and squirrel noises. Nothing comes close. That is, until I decide to entertain the Sasquatch theory. I came across the Sierra Sounds. My girlfriend and I had a weird encounter last night while traveling home from work. On our way home, we were going around a tight corner in the mountains. As we were slowing down to take the corner, we both stared directly at what appeared to be a cow, a pure black cow. Now that's all it could have been, a cow, and we could have been paranoid. But the ducked up thing was that I had my bright lights on. And it did not light this thing up. And as my light showed on it, its eyes were the brightest neon green we have seen, plus they were a lot closer than what a cow's eyes should be. And we both had the same thought and said it at the same time, that's not a cow. Again, it had the body and shape of a cow, but its eyes did not match them. We both got the same bone-chilling feeling while staring at this thing. Our stomachs were churning, and both of us got a chill down our spines. Needless to say, I sped past that cow. Again, we both could have been paranoid. It was late, we were tired. There were a lot of things to consider. But we both have farm histories, and it was just a weird encounter overall. I am in Moorhead, Kentucky, and have been experiencing unexplainable things while I've been hiking around Eagle Lake or near Cave Run. I'm not a superstitious person and am very rational when it comes to the animals in our region. It will sound as if something is approaching, coming much closer than any animal should, and when noticed, I react, stomp my feet, etc., it stops. An unrelenting dread and overwhelming anxiety fall over me. I cannot shake it, and I know I have to leave at that point. Each time, as I've started to leave, whatever it is has charged quickly, coming much closer and essentially chasing me from where I've been. I refused to return to Eagle Lake after experiencing it for the first time and chose to go to a pretty popular area near Cave Run. The same exact thing has happened more than once. I have not been able to shake the feeling. I have definitely been the only one in the area on both occasions, and there have been no animals near, definitely not ones large enough to make the sounds I've heard. My girlfriend has been with me on each occasion and has heard and felt the same as me. When I was in middle school, I lived on a hill that had a graveyard on it. I had a friend who pulled all-nighters with me. In the summer, the light was here pretty much all night, so it was never creepy. As we were heading down the hill, I didn't know why, but I glanced back and saw a little girl in a white dress. This was around 2 or 3 a.m. I stopped, and she walked into the woods, which the graveyard was like 100 yards away from. I asked my friend if he saw her, and he did. We both thought it was weird, so we went up to see where she went but saw no sign of her. 3 years later, I have a class in high school with a teacher who loves local ghost stories, so every Friday he tells us 1 or 2 new ones. Then he talks about the girl at the hill cemetery, and it snaps back to me. I got chills from the thought. My friends and I decided to visit the graveyard at night because we were dumb and young and generally creepy, so one tried to spook us by hiding. 5 minutes later, he walks up, looking pale and asking to leave. He points to the woods, saying a little girl just tried talking to him, and I felt like we were being watched from the trees. This happened when I was 4 or 5. I was in the bathroom of the house my family and I were living in. I was over by the toilet and looking towards the other side of the bathroom, where the tub and door to get in and out of the bathroom were. Out of the blue, some blurry, static-looking, personish things appeared. The person was nude, but as I said, it was blurry. I could make out that it was a person, but I couldn't make out what gender it was due to, well, the blur. I also couldn't see its face because it had this long black hair in front of its face, like Slash from Guns N' Roses. Now fast forward to a little over 3.5 years ago. I was working in a group home for mentally challenged people, and one of my clients was terminally ill. A few weeks before his death, while I was doing an overnight shift, I was sleeping for a bit. Staff was allowed to sleep for a few hours overnight in this house. I woke up in full-blown sleep paralysis, and I saw, well, a more defined version of what I had seen almost 30 years earlier. I still couldn't figure out who or what it was since they stood with their backs to me. About 2 years ago, my mother and I were driving around my grandfather's property, several hundred acres of Australian bush in Queensland. We stopped at one of the various lakes around the property and had lunch there. As we were walking back to our car, I told a joke, and as my mother burst out into laughter, something somewhere in the bush mimicked her laugh right back at us. My mother and I both looked at each other in bewilderment. Lyre birds, native birds that copy sounds, aren't native to the area, the environment is too hot. Perplexed, I called out, "Hello?" I got a deeper pitched hello back. My mother and I looked at each other again and ran to the car, and as we started it and drove off, in the rear vision mirror, we both saw something moving in the trees, something tall and thin, breaking branches. Needless to say, we haven't been back there since. So I work as a security guard at an intelligence company, and I'm on the night watch, which is from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. There's 3 buildings on the lot that are completely surrounded by a fence with alarms and only one gate to get onto the lot, which is manned 24/7. The lot has been closed for a week due to COVID, and no one has been on or off other than security personnel. All buildings are locked at all times since no one is there to work. I was doing my rounds in one of the buildings, and as I was leaving, I heard an office door slam shut. I am the only one doing rounds, and everyone else is at their posts. I asked, "Who's in here?" and received no response. As I started to walk towards where I heard the noise, I heard a man say, "I'm sorry." But it was right next to my ear. I can only describe the voice as a deep, raspy, sarcastic sound that sent chills through my whole body. I immediately turned to see who was there, but no one was. I immediately called the gate, and they said no one's been on. I then called the alarm monitor, and he said he had received nothing. I swept the whole building, and no office doors were closed in the entire building. I left and sat in my truck watching the 2 entrances and exits for the rest of my shift, and no one ever left. I will never forget the sound of that man's voice in my ear. When I was younger, probably 10 years old, I was staying a couple days at my stepmother's little brother's house. We're about the same age. One day we went behind the neighborhood to walk or explore in the woods in an undeveloped area. After about 5 minutes, we both kind of stopped each other and held each other back, and were like, "What's that?" Because we thought we saw a man just standing in the woods, maybe 100 feet away. We looked for another few seconds before we realized it was some type of giant bird sitting on a tree that had fallen over. We both turned around and took off running. This thing was probably 5 feet tall and had a human head or face that was red, the body was black. Years and years went by, and I never talked about it or saw anything like it ever again. I decided to bring up a get-together we were having one night, to make sure I wasn't crazy or something, and we both described the exact same thing exactly as I remembered it. I was worried that he wasn't going to remember it at all, but 20 years later, we both remembered it exactly the same. This happened in a primarily Mexican South Texas town, and we were told that it may have been La Chusa, which is a Mexican folklore of an owl witch that has human features. I was 12 and moving from Ohio to Michigan with my family. We are moving into a townhouse. My mother went to get the keys from the leasing office. My siblings and I stayed outside of the townhouse, waiting for her. I decided to go up to the front door and play with the doorbell and knock on the door a lot. I wasn't expecting any trouble because no one was in there. However, after doing it a bunch of times, the door started to open. Reminding you, this is the door that was supposedly empty and locked. Hence, my mother went to get the key in the first place. The door opened, and I saw an old white man looking down at me. He never said anything. He looked extremely peeved. His facial expression did not change. He had the most wrinkles I've ever seen on someone's face. And he looked extremely unhappy or annoyed. Ironically, he was dressed like Mr. Rogers, green sweater vest and khakis. I looked up at him and said, "I'm sorry. I didn't know anybody lived here." After I said that to him, he closed the door. My mother returned a few minutes later with the key. My siblings and I all went up to her, panicking. I remember the first thing we did was yell, "Mama, Mama, Mama," when we saw her come back. We told her what happened. My mother had a look of fear in her eyes. Me and my siblings walked behind her as she walked up to the door. After she unlocked the door, we saw that the inside was empty. There was no old man. I was hiking with my dad in late September on the west coast of Vancouver Island, which is usually when bears are fatting up for hibernation and most likely to be aggressive, and since we were a couple days' walk from either trailhead and medical attention, we were on high alert. It had rained constantly, and we had only seen a single other hiker the whole time. He was traveling in the opposite direction as we were. He was heading north, we were Ute bound, and we had camped beside him 2 nights prior. So for the whole trip, the only tracks that we saw that looked remotely fresh were a single set of hiking boots coming towards us, left by a pleasant and solitary German tourist, and we only saw them in places with extensive overhead cover. All other tracks were washed out and filled with rainwater due to the days and days of constant rain that was doing the best it could to duck up our vacation and make our packs even heavier. We were approaching a blackberry patch between ridges that hugged a small creek and smelled what we thought was a particularly stinky bear, and since the blackberries were on both sides of the trail with only about 3 meters between them, we had our heads on a swivel. There were no overhanging trees, as this particular berry patch was dozens of meters across and 2 or more meters high. My dad told me to hurry through as quick as we could and made a comment about how smart it was that we were wearing bear bells and how dangerous it is to startle a feeding bear. He was a couple meters ahead of me when I looked down and saw a footprint. It looked like an unshoed human footprint, except that it was 2 inches wider and at least 2 inches longer than mine, and I am 14 feet. It also had dermal ridges and only had a couple raindrops in it, so whatever made it had stepped there literally moments before. The scariest thing about it was that there were no other prints, so whatever had made that track had stepped out of the eastern side of the berry patch across the trail, 3 meters, and into the western patch in a single step. I was so startled that I looked around as much as I could before my dad lovingly told me to hurry the duck up. And that was the only track there that wasn't now a small puddle, so before you discount it as a double-stepping bear paw print, where a bear's back paw steps into the print of its front paw, there is no way a black bear could have crossed the 3-meter distance without leaving more prints. Say what you want about bears, they are not at all graceful. There are also no grizzly bears on the island, and a cougar wouldn't have left a print that looked anything like that, even if it stepped in its own track. It also couldn't have been a hoax because a person couldn't just stand in the berry patch with a pole with a footprint on it, as they would be interacting with bears on a dangerously consistent basis. Also, why would someone sit in a berry patch in the relentless west coast rain in the hopes of pranking people that might not pass by for days? It doesn't really make sense to go to that much effort, risk that much danger, and basically swim in a lacerating blackberry bush for multiple days. I was a service plumber for years, and that smell is still in my top 5 worst smells of all time. And I will never forget the image of the raindrops hitting that fresh track as I stared in disbelief. I used to live on the eastern band of Cherokee Indians reservation in the Smoky Mountains. There's a spot called Thomas Divide, and it's been known for decades to have unexplained floating orbs. You're supposed to pull off at that lookout, flash your lights 3 times at the mountains, and wait. It's a known phenomenon that's even been written about. So one night, my ex and I decided to go check it out. We drive up to the pull-off at night, park on the left part of the clearing, turn off the vehicle, flash our lights 3 times at the mountains below, and wait. It's dark out, but the pull-off is basically a gravel clearing surrounded by woods, and the moon was full, so you could see the whole area very well. We could both see the entire area around the car, and there was no one else there. We both had our windows rolled down. Most of the pull-off area we are in is to my right, since we pulled in more to the left, and we are facing towards the mountains. We were just talking and having a nice time, and my ex flashed his lights 3 times again since nothing had happened yet. I have my arm hanging out of my window, and I'm looking up at the stars, and I loudly announce that this is stupid and that nothing is happening. Well, immediately after my announcement, we start hearing the sound of footsteps at the end of the clearing, heading in our direction, towards my side of the car. They were coming fast, but they sounded light and quick, like they belonged to a small person, so maybe like a child running. I am a skeptic first, and I figured there must be an explanation. It's quite bright from the moon, so I can see everything, but I'm just not seeing anything running in my direction. I can only hear the gravel crunching and the sound of footsteps. I start hanging out of my window, straining to see what could be heading in our direction, because obviously there must be an explanation, and I want to see what's coming towards us. The footsteps come right up to my car door, and something physically hits my door. I'm hanging out my window at this point, looking at my door and the ground next to it, and I never saw a thing. However, whatever invisible thing ran up to us hit my door with enough force that it made a banging sound, like someone had punched it, and the car rocked slightly. You could see and hear the impact, but could not see what made it. My ex's eyes got big, and he asked if it was me who did that. He thought I was playing with him, though he had heard the footsteps and knew those had nothing to do with me. I told him, hell no, I didn't do that. So he reversed his car as fast as possible and sped out of there and back home as fast as he could. He was looking all around outside as well once we heard the footsteps, but he never saw what was making the footsteps either, he could only hear them. I live in a country in Eastern Europe, and when I was about 15 years old, I was a smoker of cigarettes and always had to hide from my parents or relatives when I wanted to smoke one because they didn't approve. I lived in an apartment building maybe 10 to 15 feet from a medieval or historical fortress that was built during the Hungarian King Ladislaus I, 1077 to 1095. The fortress is the city's emblematic symbol and a historical masterpiece. So as usual, in the evening, around 6 to 7 p.m. summertime, I would enter Fortress Yard, climb a very small hill, and sit on the ground, enjoying my tobacco. One evening, as I went to have a smoke in this place, I saw from afar a person entering the fortress yard. This is not unusual, as a lot of people visit the fortress, so I didn't mind. P.S. There was nobody else at that time in the fortress yard beside me and this person who just entered. I continue to smoke and watch this tall person as he slowly walks in my direction, wearing all black clothes and a black hat. I think to myself that this person is a little bit strange looking, but again, I don't mind. I was there just enjoying nature and my smoke. The creepy part that gives me chills to this day is this. So this person was slowly walking towards me and didn't change direction. This is about a 3-minute walk from the entrance to the place where I was sitting, and as he got closer, I could see that this thing or person had no face, no eyes, no face profile, was all black, and looked like a complete black shadow shaped like a human. I completely freeze and think to myself, I must be crazy, or maybe I'm not seeing well, but this thing keeps getting closer to me, and when it got in front of me, it literally entered the ground. Yes, it entered the ground like a shadow in 1 second and disappeared. I was so freaking scared, I almost fainted. I was scared to even get up and run to the exit on the same path as this thing. I tried calling several of my friends so I could talk to somebody and not feel alone as I exited the fortress yard, and all of them had their phones dead or without service, which was all very strange. I tried calling 7 people, and all 7 were out of reach, had no signal, or the phone was dead. I finally found the courage to get up and run as fast as I could while trying to call people, not looking back. The second I exited the yard, I could call all my friends, as they all had service and signal again. I want to mention that my phone had full service and signal the entire time. This was the last time I went to the fortress. I'm now 26 years old, and I still can't figure out what the hell that thing was. I have never encountered something like that since then. When I was 9, my family and I lived in a suburb that used to be farmland. There were still some heritage farms that were on the outskirts, so it was old and history rich. The house was a bungalow, and the first floor felt warm. But the basement had a very different feeling. We had a playroom down the stairs near my dad's workshop and a bathroom. To walk to the playroom, my sister and I would have to walk past the bathroom, which I always ran past. Even playing downstairs, I hated being alone. My sister and I would have to flick the light off and race up the stairs because we were both so scared. Occasionally, when using the bathroom, I felt like I was being watched. Fast forward, we were preparing to move and renovate some stuff. I shared a bunk bed with my sister. I was the top bunk. My toddler brother slept in the room beside us. My parents were at the end of the hall. Everything seemed normal off to bed. Sleeping. In the middle of the night, I am awoken. Innocently enough, I look over to my left, and I see a black-haired figure. Now, normally, alarm bells would go off. But I felt like I was still in a dream, like I was in this calm trance-like state. I was 9, I didn't know what it was or that it was even real. But it was an IT. I am awestruck, and I realize IT is holding a tray with a silver lid. I sit up a bit, and the black cloaked figure removes the lid from the tray. Beneath it is a hunting paw trap. I don't know how to describe it. But it was a large paw trap, like a bear. Curious, I lean forward to touch it. Probably believing this isn't real. I am about to touch it. I can still see my fingers reaching into my head as I tell this story. Suddenly, as I am about to place my hand on the mechanism, it snaps shut. I suddenly snapped out of this trance-like state I was in. And the fear overwhelms me. I am gripping my blankets and trying not to breathe. I don't understand. I am paralyzed with fear. I can't even call my parents because I am scared of attracting their attention. I just pretend to sleep. And muffle my crying. That night, I never slept. I wet my bed and never called my mother. I was so scared. I never told anyone until years later, for fear it was actually real. When we were house hunting a few years later, my mother insisted on having a basement that was homey, and thus, over a discussion about why she felt that way, I confided in her what had happened. She was very understanding. She didn't dismiss or overly feed into my feelings of fear. She did put a Bible under my bed. We aren't very religious. But it made me feel safe. She told me it wasn't real. And I took that at face value. It wasn't until I was 13 that I was sitting around a campfire telling scary stories. My inebriated dad states that he has the scariest story of all. My mother shoots him a death glare and tells him to swallow it. But he continues. Apparently, when we were living at that house, my dad woke up in the middle of the night. And felt something was wrong. He says he got out of bed and checked on my brother first. He is fine. As he is leaving my brother's room and looks down the hallway to my sister's and my bedroom, he sees a black-haired figure running out of our bedroom towards the stairs to the basement. Thinking there is a burglar or a pedo in the house, he chases it into the basement and grabs his military-issue rifle. Except there isn't anything there. By this time, my mother is awakened to his yelling and already dialing 911. The cops arrive and check the house. All the windows and doors are locked, and no one is in the house. Sitting by the fire and listening to my dad's story and how closely it resembles my story shook me, and I began trembling. The reality of it still shakes me. Apparently, my father and mom had the house blessed by a priest soon after. Interestingly, I do remember having a person, who I now know was a priest, pray with us as we buried a Virgin Mary and baby Jesus statue in the front yard. When I was about 17, I lived in an old Florida home that didn't have AC, just a big fan that would blow air into the attic. It had wooden floors and a one-room addition attached to the kitchen off the living room. It's not a fancy house, but I was happy to have it. I never experienced anything while living there for about a year. Just a small, creaky house. One night around 11 p.m., I was awake, sober, and lucid and decided to poke around in the fridge before going to bed. The only person there was my girlfriend at the time. She was in the second room, not the back addition. I never heard anything, but I felt or sensed it. Someone is walking from the second room to the fridge. I thought it was my girlfriend at the time. I started casually talking to her about something I can't recall. As I pulled my head out of the fridge and stood upright, I looked to my right, and reality completely bent for me. I was staring face to face with what I found out later was a shadow person. It was the outline of a person, with the substance of it being pure black, no light traveled through it. Inside the black, it was like clouds swirling around. It was fully three-dimensional and just stood there staring at me, and I did. I heard an odd background sound, like a low hum. It wasn't very loud. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. I have no way of knowing how long we sat face to face, about 2 feet apart. My mind was completely blank. I'm sure I just sat there staring, eyes wide and mouth open. Suddenly, it started to walk past me to the back room. I followed it completely. It walked into the wall, and as it disappeared, 3 waves spiraling out came from the wall, and it was gone. I immediately ran out the front door and into the street. My girlfriend heard me run full speed out of the house. She ran out and asked what happened. I explained everything to her. I stayed out in the street till daylight. I was shocked at what I saw. I became obsessed with it and read anything I could on the subject, and I found out later that lots of people had experienced the exact same thing. What bothers me still to this day is, why did this thing show itself to me? Why did I have this experience? Why hasn't it happened again? It was insane and so random. I've been trying to make sense of it ever since. My parents were invited to have coffee at the home of some friends. My sister, 11, and I came along. This couple had 2 children our age, whom we knew since we were babies. They had a finished basement that had a kitchen and a sitting area. So, the grown-ups, were having a fun conversation down there. We kids got bored after a while. This was before computers, iPads, etc., and it was already dark outside. My sister Dee said, "Let's play hide and seek." Our friend Sarah had a younger sister who was 6. So we were trying to find something fun for her to do as well. So Sarah started counting to 50 downstairs in the living room. My sister, Sarah's sister, and I headed upstairs towards the bedrooms, hoping to find a good hiding spot. We went into their parents' bedroom and hid behind the bed while we faced the door. We were planning to duck and hide ourselves once Sarah came up the stairs. The room was pitch dark, except for the street light that was directly outside. The light cast a shadow on the wall in front of us. That's when I saw an unusual shadow on the wall. The shadow resembled a black pistol. I said to the two girls with me, "Do you see that weird shadow?" I looked around, but I couldn't find anything in that room that could make that shape. I walked up to it. The shadow started to slowly move backwards into an open closet. It was no longer a shadow but now looked like a black pistol pointed at us but moved backwards into the closet. I got the impression right away that it didn't want to be discovered and was trying to hide. I saw it move forcefully backward into some clothes. When it did this, the clothes moved violently as this thing hid. I asked, "Did you see that?" And both girls whispered yes. I almost had the nerve to go in and move everything to find it, but suddenly got creeped out, and we ran downstairs. We didn't even care that Sarah never found us. But we announced that we didn't want to play anymore. We went from energetic kids to very quiet for the rest of the stay. We didn't say anything to anyone. But I told my parents a year later because it always bothered me. It felt evil, and it had some intelligence. I've always wondered if that family ever saw it or if they had other experiences, but I've never heard anything about it. I don't know why we saw it, what it was doing there, or why it was shaped like a pistol. I was invited to their house when I was around 20. Sarah was getting married. Her mother wanted to show us the dress she bought for the wedding. But I couldn't bring myself to go back to that bedroom. So I stayed downstairs.